I'm going to do something different than I usually do with these photographs. I've probably over the last 10 years now been tracking down different repositories to try and find where 20th century photographs of Native people are not really the kind of photographs that you've been seeing so far, but the kind of photographs produced by the federal government in a PR effort to publicize its work in Indian boarding schools. And then that, as you'll see, led to other kinds of photographic repositories. So in a sense, this is kind of a travelogue of where you find some of these photographic collections in expected and unexpected places, and then what kind of photographs do you find in those collections, and the photographs themselves tell us sometimes expected and sometimes unexpected things. So I'm going to try and restrain myself from talking too much about the content of each photo itself, although that's going to be very difficult for me. We'll see how it goes. This, as I said, is not a photograph. This is that Catlin painting that Paula showed a minute ago, but it's one of the earliest representatives that I know of this genre before and after depictions that becomes a really popular photographic genre, particularly in the boarding school settings. Of course, what's different is the before is the good thing here, right? And what civilization does to this poor sap is the bad thing, the after. And there's actually another version of this Catlin where he's also got a sword, kind of swashbuckling thing, strapped to his waist, except that it's going between his legs, so if he actually takes a step, he's going to be flat on his face. Okay, which one is it? Ah, got it. So here's the photographic, some photographic examples. The first set are John Choate photos, and these are the Fort Marion Apaches arriving at Carlisle before and then after. Another similar set also by John Choate, and this is probably the most published and most famous set of the Navajo Dene, Tom Torlino before and after. And I'm indebted to Rod Slemons, who's a photo historian up in Seattle. I unfortunately don't have actual slides to show you, but Rod has documented in a number of these before and after photographs, either the before or the after negatives were retouched to make their skin color darker in the before and or lighter in the after photographs. But I'm sorry, I don't have actual examples of that to show you. There were a lot of these images produced, disseminated in the popular press, in publications like Harper's, later on in Sunset even. But this is an important part of the government's PR work, to show the great work they're doing in the boarding schools and accomplishing at least a physical representation of this intended transformation. So this is an Isaac Davidson before and after, actually just after set. And this one was titled Transformed Indian Girls in Oregon. So this is from the Salem School, still running today as Chemawa Indian High School. Another Davidson photo, also from Salem, Transformed Indian Students. Now why the boys get to be called students and the girls just get to be called girls is another story. This is one of another example of the before and after genre. I could go on for hours about this one. I just love this one. But this was one that was produced in that postcard format that's been so popular over the years. Here's another before and after set. These particular images now are from the Hampton Museum, from the Hampton Normal School in Hampton, Virginia, which of course was established after the Civil War to educate newly freed African Americans, but for a brief time anyway, also enrolled Native students. So the Hampton Museum has a wonderful archive of images in this kind of expected before and after genre, but some images you might not expect to find in the Hampton Museum. They were very concerned to stay in touch with their alumni, and in fact school employees, this was also true at Carlisle, would travel out during the summers to various western reservations to document that in fact their students, had not, in the parlance of the times, gone back to the blanket, but were living these upright and civilized lives. So they also took photographs of Hampton and later Carlisle alumni in their homes, and they would publish these in the school newspapers. So you can see very clearly, this is Israel Hill and his wife at Oneida in Wisconsin in 1909. You can see some of the internalization of values, decor, that Native people are starting to bring into their homes and their lives. And that's just a wonderful glimpse. This particular photo, also from Hampton, is of Benjamin Brave and his family at Lower Brule. Obviously, I think, a commercial sitting where the family had gone in and paid a photographer to take this image, which was not unknown among Native communities. Now what I want to do is take you through a sampling of images from a couple of different collections around the U.S. As I said, some expected and unexpected places and images. Since I work in the history of Indian education, I'm very interested in tracking down images of boarding schools or school life. When I was up teaching at the University of Washington, I heard that a museum in Spokane, MONAC, or the Museum of Native American Culture, had a rather unique collection from the turn of the century of photographs of schools. And so I went over to visit, and lo and behold, there was just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of photographs collected by this woman, Estelle Reel. Estelle was the superintendent of Indian schools from 1898 to 1910. At that time, this was a position in the federal government that required a Senate ratification of a presidential appointment. Ms. Reel, who came from Wyoming, had been very active in the Republican Party, I think it was, helped get Harding elected president, and as a result, as a political appointment, was appointed the superintendent of Indian schools. She had a background as a superintendent of public instruction in Wyoming, which included purview over the prison system. No commentary about how that was perhaps appropriate at the time. This raised an absolute firestorm, as you might imagine, in the American press. This is the first woman appointed to a federal position high enough to require Senate ratification, and it was just a media frenzy for the day. Well, Estelle did her job, married at rather a late age, in her 50s, to a gentleman who was at that time the largest non-native leaseholder on the Yakima reservation, spent the rest of her life in Yakima, lived to be in her 90s, had no children, of course, and so the story goes. There's these boxes of negatives and photographs. Absolutely priceless collection that ends up in a yard sale in Toppenish, Washington. This doctor from Seattle by the name of Arden Sahlquist, who collected those postcards of Indian stuff, Indian scenes, stumbles across it completely by accident, buys up the whole lot, and eventually ends up in the collections of MONAC and now the Cheney Coles Museum, Eastern Washington Historical Society. So there's rather mundane and predictable kind of images such as this one of Haskell Institute in Lawrence, Kansas. And none of these are, very, very few of these are individually dated, but they all come from her tenure of 1898 to 1910. Documenting the kind of trades that are being taught. So here's boys at Toma building a house, learning how to do carpentry. This one is from, there's a whole series, so there's a series from individual schools. These next images are all from the Oneida School in 1904. These are some that are dated. This is the first grade learning how to darn socks. This is a cooking classroom, also at Oneida. So there's real emphasis on domestic training for girls. Just the basic daily practices, physical and other practices of running a quote-unquote civilized. This is actually, although you wouldn't guess it from looking at it, a laundry lesson. Let's see if this works. My little pointer here. Can you see the illustration of the wash tub with the little
what do you call those things?
Scrub board. Thank you. That's up one. So that's a laundry lesson. This is probably a little more obviously an ironing lesson. Is it possible to focus? Oh, he's gone. Oh, can you focus it a little bit? I'm not sure, it might be an out of focus slide, but you can see the girls practicing on the wash tubs in the back there. This is what Estelle Real loved to call actual work. As opposed to what? Virtual work? Not amazing, huh? But she had, I mean, she was a woman of strong ideas, let's put it politely. And she, very much like many people of her time, was very much convinced of what we would call a racialist scientific theory of the different abilities of the races. So in her view, Native people had very undeveloped moral and mental capabilities. So what's gonna raise them up to civilization was this actual work versus any kind of higher academic instruction. She thought that was pretty silly. And here's the dressmaking class at Oneida. This is, I tried to, as I went through my slides, I tried to pull southwestern ones. This is the girls' sitting room at the Phoenix Indian School. So you can see the kind of refined environment. This was actually a really debatable issue in the Federal Indian Service at the time, was how high a level of civilized living do we want to train these people up to? And there was a huge debate over whether there should be piano lessons or not. A number, including Estelle, thought, you know, that's putting people a little above their place. Whereas others, you know, thought, oh, the civilizing influences of classical music is be a great influence on these kids. There's also, you can't believe the debates you read about in the federal records, but one was over the relative advantages of wallpaper versus whitewash, which had the more civilizing influence. This is also Phoenix Indian School. This is the boys in the workshop, in the wood shop. And then there's these other images that are just my favorites from the Estelle Real collection. You know, it wasn't just training in trades and domestic arts and skills that went on in these schools. There's this really intense scrutiny on the individual and the remaking of them in every aspect of their social life, family, relations, expression of emotion. I mean, this was actually part of the curriculum, how to teach Indian kids how to emotionally express themselves because of that stereotype of stoicism, which, you know, I can only imagine for kids this age in this alien environment, you have to imagine there were days when they were scared to death and determined not to show it. So don't show the enemy your fear. This little image here is entitled Tea Party at Puyallup. So this is one of the schools in the Puget Sound area, and you can see the little teacups and their little tea party here. And in the background is a very typical product of the boys' workshop, is these model homes. So this is in miniature how kids are learning some of the skills they're expected to have later on. And this is another one you could talk about for days. This is from Fort Bidwell School in California. It's the kindergarten class playing the soldier game. I don't know what you know about the history of Native people in California, but for these kids to play soldiers had to be an absolutely terrifying experience. But there they are with their little American flags. That's a great image. Now, speaking of unexpected things, there's a memoir written by a woman by the name of Thisba Houston, who taught early on in the first federal schools amongst the Lakota right after their pacification. And in her memoirs, she talks about allowing the girls to go out in the schoolyard and recreate these representations of camp life. And they have out of canvas and I guess my pointer's pretty much giving up the ghost. Over on the right, you can see the little teepee made out of sort of the red gingham tablecloth thing. And that the girls would make little meat drying racks and little representations of people and horses out of little twig people and twig horses. And in Thisba's memoirs, although you can't see it in this particular photo, often these schools that were located near the camps were fenced in to keep the kids in and the parents out. And Thisba talks about the older Lakota people coming up to the fence, and in Thisba's, was rather romantically and nostalgically painting this picture of the older folks fondly gazing on this recreation of camp life that was no more. So when I actually found this photograph, I was just thrilled to death to find the actual representation of that scene at Lakota, except this photograph is identified as being at Crow Agency, which is either a mistake or this happened at more than one place during that period of time. But I think there's a whole dissertation in that as well, in terms of almost immediately after the pacification, this immediate romanticizing, nostalgic framing of certain aspects of Native life they're going to allow within the context of the school, which is a real anomaly for for that time or for the next 70 years, as far as that goes. Okay, so that's some of the Estelle Real materials. I also have a set of images from the National Archives, and these are images that I also, I find all this stuff exciting, can't you tell? But these are not in the quote-unquote photographic collections. The National Archives has a photographic collections. It's located in the DC area out in Suitland, Maryland. But the paper archives, the documentary archives, are down at 7th and Pennsylvania. In addition to the regional branches of the National Archives, which are located in, Kansas City, in Fort Worth, in Laguna Niguel, California, in Seattle. So regionally, all federal records go to these repositories. And then some of them go to the DC archive. So depending on what kind of material you're looking for, you can find them at either of those places. And embedded in those documentary archives are, in fact, lots and lots and lots of photographs. So I thought I'd just give some examples. And I think these are the photographs that are often going to be of tremendous interest to local communities, to tribal communities. There is so much history here, both in the paper documents and in the photographs, that's just kind of buried and by and large not looked at very often. But there are these reports. This is a home ec instructor's report that goes back to DC. It's just full of photographs. And this particular set is all from Pima. It's all from Gila River Reservation. So it's about home ec instruction. Very often, a lot of these photographs in these farmers' reports, field matrons' reports, home ec instructors' reports identify the people in the photographs, which you don't always have in historic photographs. They're not always identified, but they often are. So here you can see the girls are learning how to take care of a baby. And can you see that little doll baby in the wash basin in the middle of the photograph? They actually found a dark-skinned one. Isn't that fascinating? This is some images from the farmers' report. So there are literally these snapshots of economic and agricultural activity, documenting the life of individual reservations, individual communities throughout the 20th century. Also Gila River. And then, how do we find out about these things? Well, we go to symposia like these, which is wonderful, but not something that's been happening necessarily for a long period of time. I mean, when I started graduate school, which is, I almost hesitate to say, really before the internet. I don't know if students can imagine that now. I know some of you have used card catalogs. How did you find out about archives and what we're in? You were either lucky and had a mentor as a faculty member who knew this stuff and liked you enough to tell you, or you didn't. But eventually you learn a little bit and you meet people and you make friends and you learn that there's this community of scholars and colleagues out there in the world, and you share information. And I think that's a great thing about this symposium is continuing that tradition. I have a dear friend and colleague, Tom Biolsi, who'd done research up at Pine Ridge and stumbled across in the National Archives what are called the industrial surveys. And the industrial surveys were undertaken in the 1920s. It was not a survey of what factories were built on reservations. It just meant, are Indians being industrious or not? And how did you tell that? And for a whole long story here, I won't go into all of it, it was decided that the primary marker of industrial, in other words, civilized living, was the kind of houses people were living in, their architecture. So this circular order went out from the Commissioner of Indian Affairs in DC to every agent on every reservation across the country and with a stack of blank, I guess they were mimeographed forms. Visit every home and fill in this information. Who lives there? How old are they? What levels of education do they have? Do they have a milk cow? Do they have chickens? Do they have a root cellar? Root cellar is another paramount marker of civilized life in the 1920s. That's another story. Do they have a root cellar? What do they have in it? And take a picture of their house. So in these boxes in the industrial surveys are these stacks with a picture of every house of every Native person on every reservation in this country. It's unbelievable. So I just got a smattering of them. This is from Greenville, California. And see this great stuff. There's this commentary by the agents on all of these things. So this one, let's see. Old-time Indian digger home, abandoned 1915, and in big block letters so you can't miss it. No one living here. The agent didn't want anybody in DC to think that any of the Indians on his agency were still living in a place like this. And then here's squatters near Susanville. So this is a little community called Indian Heights. And then this is Patton and Fee home in Susanville itself, one of clearly the more prosperous families in this community. And like I say, California has its own unique history, but a land base by and large has not been part of Native people's heritage in California until more recent times. So this 1920s were really tough times in California and elsewhere. Here's a couple images from Pawnee with a commentary. This person has a hard time making a living. But once again, here's a more prosperous family. And I included this one particularly because, like I say, these are all identified. These are identified families by name. So this is a priceless, priceless resource for tribal community research. Now here's a little series from Supai, Havasupai up in northern Arizona. And you also get a sense of the agents who were supervising these Native constituencies. The guy at Greenville, California clearly had tremendous respect for the Native people he was working with. The agent at Havasupai clearly detested everything about this place and the people and him having to be here. And his commentary goes like this. This is a ramble shack hut, and he denigrates the people who live here because they're gamblers. Of course, that was a big sin then, and some people still think so. Here's a very crude Supai home in his, in the agent's estimation. He criticizes these folks because they have no root cellar. And they really like jewelry that they buy from catalogs, so that QVC home shopping business is nothing new either. This one, in his terms, resembles more a huge crow's nest than an actual house of a human being. And then also in this set of photographs from Havasupai, now from the federal government's perspective, a great thing happened at Supai in 1910, which was a flood, which, you know, they're in the Grand Canyon. It's the Colorado River. There's a reason those houses look the way they did. But the government said, whoa, cool. We can go in there, and I have to say, at tremendous expense, millwork, milled lumber, framing, windows, doors. They packed all this down on mule, right? No helicopter delivery. It must have cost the government an arm and a leg, but the point was they had to get civilized accommodations down there. So this is one of those post-1910 houses, and the agent's really happy about this, but he's not really happy about what's in the backyard and who's in the backyard. So there's a young family living in the government-built house, but their dad refuses to live there. He lives out in the backyard, and that's the dad there. And when I saw this image, I thought, oh, this is great. Clearly this guy is not going to do what his agent tells him to do. And then I discovered in a different part of the archives, there's a whole set of letters from this man to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. And no, he was not literate in English. But he found himself an interpreter, and he sat down and he dictated a letter to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. And it turns out, in fact, that this guy is a rather important person at Supine. He has a lot of political power, and in fact, he and the agent are locked in this battle over determining where young Havasupai men are actually going to work. Because the agent wants them to work on the reservation for him, right? Doing business that the agency needs to get done, free. But there's paying jobs out there. They've just set up this park thing at the Grand Canyon. And there's ranchers who need cattlemen. And you can sell hay. And so this guy writes this wonderfully chatty and polite letter to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs saying, how are you? I'm fine. Broke my arm last year, but it's really a lot better now. By the way, I think I shall not sell my hay to the agent this year. And it goes into this whole explanation of where Supai people are actually going to work to make a living wage versus free labor for the federal agent. So we get a glimpse here, both photographically and especially paired up with the documentary record, of what's the reality of life in the 1920s. Did the federal government have power over Native people? Boy, you betcha. Incredible powers of surveillance, incredible powers to control labor, incredible powers to incarcerate people for the way they dressed and the length of their hair, and certainly their religious practices. But we also get these glimpses that the agents didn't always get their ways. Now, I had gone to DC, I was looking through these records, I was just so excited, I couldn't stand it, and I called Hartman and I said, oh, these are so cool. So I'm describing what I'm finding. He said, ooh, that's neat, go look at the Hopi ones. And that's a long story in itself. I had to actually browbeat the guy to let me into the stacks in the National Archives, which some of you may know is not an easy thing to do, but we did eventually find the Hopi records, and that's what the pictures look like, because there weren't any. The mimeograph sheets are all there, filled out with all this information, including, for anybody who's doing Hopi history, this is so swell, a complete record of all the food stored by every family, which I have to tell you is just phenomenal. But anyway, no photographs. There was, however, a stack of correspondence this thick in the front of the file, stretching over 6 or 7 years, and I think 3 different agency superintendents back and forth to Washington. Oh, we got your order, things are kind of busy here, no time to take pictures. You know, and it's, I don't know, it's not Pony Express, but it's really slow mail. Months go by, and letter from DC. We really would like photos, and by that time the superintendent's retired and it's somebody else, and we don't have any cameras, but we heard you had some back in DC, and would you mind sending us one? And go use your own dang budget to buy a camera, and years go by. Well, Hopis live in pueblos and they're all connected, and we can't take pictures of individual houses, and we don't care, take a picture however they live. Nowhere in that 7 years of correspondence is it ever mentioned that in 1917 Hopis outlawed photography. And the interesting thing about that to me is that some historians take the position that that outlawing of photography was with the support and collaboration and intent really of the US government, because they didn't want all those tourists that you saw in the earlier pictures coming in taking pictures of those snake dances and thereby encouraging Hopis, to do these heathen dances. But I think if that were the case, and the ban on photography had in fact been something that the US government agreed to and was instrumental in, we wouldn't have this record of 6 years of correspondence going, oh gosh, it's really busy here, we'll get those photographs done next week. Those agents couldn't admit the truth, which was Hopis wouldn't let them take those pictures. So here's a few more. These are from, this one's from Gila Crossing. I think these are all from Gila Crossing. But it's just a fantastic record of people's life in the 20s. So then I thought I should throw in a few from our own Arizona State Museum. This is a different kind of photographic collection that was assembled by the Lindermans, who were a missionary couple that taught in the, actually taught for the government in the day school. And a lot of these are more casual than the federally produced ones. Once again, they're identified by name. The various students with Mrs. Linderman here, they're learning how to make quilts. Here's the boys, once again showing this kind of miniature work that they're doing in the workshops here. They're making little beds. And then the girls are furnishing them with this little miniature quilt and a little doll baby. Their work from the, as you can see, from Maricopa Day School, that they're learning these domestic arts and sewing, and that's Mrs. Linderman there, third from the, that side, left. Oh, this is Lehigh Day School. I love this one. Can you guess what that is? It's December. It's their Christmas tree in the desert. Oh, and so if we're going to teach them how to live in a civilized way, I had to throw this one in because this is showing them how to do landscaping in the desert. Cactus garden. More house construction stuff. Okay, and then the last category, which I think is one that's often overlooked when people go looking for photographs, and this is photographs from Native families, Native peoples and Native families' personal collections. And we got a glimpse of some of these home photos yesterday, but they're also a really, really important resource for doing community and Native history. This is a photo from the collections of the Montoya family from San Juan, and this is the Montoya girls, Hieronyma at top, when they were enrolled at Santa Fe Indian School. And this is included in the publication One House, One Voice, One Heart, which is a wonderful oral history documentation project that the Pueblo, is it All Indian Pueblo Council or All Pueblo, oh well, whatever, All Pueblo Council, did this project where they took in the 1980s then high school students at Santa Fe and trained them in oral history techniques and sent them all home. And they collected from their parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, whatever, their stories of being Santa Fe Indian School students, and collected literally hundreds of these home photos of that school experience. And this is, you look through a lot of those federal boarding school photos, this one's really unusual in a lot of ways. They're in their home clothes, they're smiling. You just see different things. In my own research on Chilocco, 2 alumni were very instrumental in providing photographs that we just would not have had otherwise. Mr. Freeman Zuniga, whose dad had been a student before him, and that's in there backwards, isn't it? That's a C for Chilocco. Pointed the wrong direction. This is the state championship baseball team from the 19-teens when his dad was one of those guys. This is the first graduating class in 1894. This photo does not survive in any federal archive because the originals at Chilocco burned up in a fire in 1906. Lily Wilson and Stella Decora, so once again named people. The band, these are all photos from Freeman. And then Christine Scroggins, who was a student in the 1930s, she graduated in 39 and married Edgar Scroggins, who was graduated a couple years earlier. And like some fortunate boarding school graduates who were well trained to work in boarding schools, they actually got jobs at a boarding school and they worked at Chilocco for years. But because Edgar was a couple years older and was working in the steam plant when Christine was a senior, he had a camera, which was just unheard of. So we have a lot of these photographs of Christine and some of her classmates in the girls' dance class, the girls' basketball team, the field trips that the girls' basketball team got to make to Arkansas. This was a big deal. Their coach, who was this very liberal and forward-thinking woman and only lasted a year in the Federal Indian Service. Their prom dresses that they had made in the senior home economics class. Their graduation dresses, which they had also made in the same home economics class. And the only surviving photograph of Lizzie McCormick, who was the head matron at Chilocco for years and years and years, and a woman of mythological stature in Chilocco stories, believe me. She's the one in the middle in the black dress, and she was known to the students as Broom. Oh, whoops, I went too far. Oh, another one in backwards. Okay, you can read backwards. So the school, of course, every year would produce these panoramic photos where they'd line all the students up and the panoramic camera would go from one side to the next, which you'd think would be a tremendously controlled setting. But the great thing about this one, and this is from 1929, which you could read if it were in the right way, if you look at it closely, I mean, these photographs, let's face it, they lie to us in all kinds of ways, but you get these glimpses. And of course, what we know about boarding schools, in addition to the fact that they were very, very, very tough places, particularly in this era, but they forged enduring friendships. I mean, these people now in their 70s and 80s, and they still hang out with each other all the time. Their kids have married each other and their grandkids have married each other, and I mean, these are their enduring life relationships. And you can see them there. I mean, you can see the girls hanging out with each other and the people with their arms around one another. And we have to really admire and honor these people for their strength and resilience, and never forget the ones who didn't survive. And I'm going to close with kind of a different sort of before and after photo, which is, so these are some of the sprouts, right? These are some of the little boys. And so these panoramic cameras were slow enough that these little boys each year, there'd be some of them that would go over there on the left-hand side, assuming that's where the camera started. And it's tracking across, and by the time the camera gets over to the other side of the bleachers, oh, I put that one in backwards too, but some of those sprouts are over here on this side too. So it's kind of before and after. Same kids. So what I'd like to do to conclude is say, since my dad was one of those sprouts, and since he's the one who got me into all this, it's all his fault. And since my folks are here today and they're celebrating their 55th wedding anniversary, I'd like to have them stand and say thank you.